want to start by inviting you to fill in the blank on the next few statements. Right now, my biggest problem is blank. Right now, I am most anxious about. I am most afraid about. Or how about, I just wish that God would get me through this. Or I wish that God would get rid of this. And those are valid things. Now we know, or at least we profess to know, that God is all good and all powerful, and therefore more capable of removing every obstacle and anxiety that comes our way. And this does sometimes happen. But life experience for many of us, if not all of us, is that God doesn't always operate this way. Does this mean that he's passive about our troubles? Or the other end of the extreme, maybe he causes them? We've all asked that once or twice, right? But if we're honest, we really can't answer these questions with certainty. But let me pose another question. Is it possible that God can meet us, not to solve our problem or even to remove our problem, but to actually meet us as our problem? What if God at times tries to get our attention, but we are looking for him in the wrong place? We think that God is somehow on our side and is moving things out of our way, which does happen at times. But what if there are other times when God is our obstacle? Yes, there is plenty of biblical precedent for God as our deliverer. We see this in the Exodus story, as well as countless times for Israel, and ultimately for all of creation at the end of Revelation. But in the meantime, in this in-between time, the kingdom is here but not yet, as some say. We underestimate the power and the will of fallen humanity. And we underestimate the lengths that God will go to meet us where we are. This takes us to Genesis 32, the story of Jacob, a man who wrestled with God and lived. A quick recap of Jacob's life. Jacob's life is one marked of deceit and strife. He literally came into the world with a death grip on his brother's heel in a failed effort to be the firstborn in his family, which would give him the inheritance of his father and everything that entailed. Later in life, though, he then figured out how to trick his brother into willingly giving this inheritance or his birthright over to him, and then eventually deceived his father into blessing him with this. Oddly enough, though, with this deceit, God backs him up on this, and he gives Jacob the blessing which he had stolen through deceptive means. Eventually, however, Jacob would get a taste of his own medicine. As he ran away to work for Laban in exchange for his daughter, whom Jacob loved, Jacob was tricked. He was deceived into marrying another daughter instead of the one whom he loved, and was forced to work double the labor just so he can get the woman that he loved. And this caused a lot of drama in Jacob's life, a lot of problems that eventually God would deliver him out of, with both of his wives and plenty of wealth. But even after all this, Jacob had to go back and face his brother, whom he had stolen the birthright from long ago, whom he had deceived. And Jacob had learned from Laban that what goes around comes around. And Jacob had known God as his deliverer. But in this particular story, in Genesis 32, he finds God as something else, his problem. Jacob learned with Laban that what goes around comes around. Therefore, Jacob was certain that Esau had come to take revenge on him, and with very good reason. Jacob, therefore, was afraid for his life, the life of his family. He then decided to take matters into his own hands and separate himself from his family with the hopes that Esau's revenge would take him and him alone. This is where God meets him. Genesis 32, starting in verse 22. It says, that night Jacob got up and took 2 of his wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of a Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions, so Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with human beings and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, as he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites did not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Now, how do we know, as Jacob eventually figured out, that God shows up as our problem, not just as our problem remover? Human experience says that it's really hard to know in the moment. It's hard to know a lot of things in the moment. And Jacob, in the moment, certainly didn't know. Because as far as Jacob was concerned, he wasn't wrestling with God, but with Esau, or at the very least, a hitman that Esau had sent to take revenge on him. But Jacob's worst nightmare actually turned out to be God in the most transformative moment of his life. We don't always know in the heat of the moment what's going on, if God is meeting us as our problem. And it's not easy to know in the heat of the moment. But let's consider three aspects of the story that might give us a clue. Number one, when Jacob met God as his problem, Jacob was completely alone. It says that Jacob not only sent his family away, but his possessions. Now I'm curious, does this include food, clothing, especially weapons? All things needed to survive. He was isolated and defenseless. When have you been isolated and defenseless? Or put another way, when have you been in a situation where you were under attack and no one believed you? That is true loneliness. And I personally know it well. But you see, Jacob had spent his entire life through deceit and cheating, running from vulnerability. But now he has finally embraced weakness. He has embraced defensiveness. Is God waiting for us? Is he waiting for you to be vulnerable and defenseless? Even if that means no one believes you or no one sees you? Number two, the problem lingers. The fight between Jacob and God was an all-nighter, until finally, it is God, interestingly enough, God taps out. God says, "Let me go," for Jacob had overcome him. Is it possible that in doing all the right things in facing our problems, we pray, we persevere, we stay the course, we keep our integrity, we keep fighting for a cause? Is it possible, though, that even in all those noble things, we are actually fighting God? And in overcoming God, preventing what he wants to do in and through us? I don't know the answers to these questions necessarily, but it keeps coming up. These problems keep coming up. You're still alone, and you're still defensive. You're still defenseless. But you keep fighting because your cause is just. And if our cause is just, eventually the ends justify our means. But in those situations, though, our true selves tend to show themselves. Jacob's true self eventually came out here. In the moment where God requested to be let go, Jacob, as is his nature, saw an opportunity to seize a blessing. but he didn't know who he was talking to. How long have you been facing this problem of yours? How long do you keep fighting the fight? Maybe it's time to reconsider our ways. Or is our cause, our justification, worth going through anyone who might be in our way, even if that's God? There is a time to fight on, but there's also a time to relent. Consider the fight you're in right now. How has it changed you? Which brings us to number 3. Number 3 is that not only does the problem still linger, but the effects still linger. When Jacob accepted vulnerability and engaged in the fight, he had accepted that his life was essentially over. Have you ever had a dream die? Have you ever had failure? Have you been hurt, especially in the church? Is this wound still open even today? After this encounter, Jacob was never the same. He had been blessed. He had been given a new name and was given the lineage of the people of Israel, but at great cost. He would be physically vulnerable for the rest of his days. And oh, by the way, he still didn't know if Esau wanted to kill him or not. So he had to limp out to meet his brother, possibly to be killed. Although that didn't happen, that didn't matter to Jacob. All that mattered to him was that he had met God face to face and lived. Because although God sometimes may come to us as a problem, it is not to bring death, but life and life to the full. The relationship between God and our hardships is mysterious and complicated. And this story does not give an exhaustive explanation of how this relationship works. Because not all of our hardships are of God. Sometimes our problems are made from ourselves. But God certainly suffered many hardships. However, this story invites us to look for God in places where in our minds he could not possibly be. Our failures, our faults, our problems. Everything I've talked about in this message, I can personally relate to. And I have personally experienced everything that I have laid out. However, I don't feel compelled to actually share the details in the story, because ultimately that's not what matters. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what I went through. It doesn't matter that I, in fact, in my early 20s, was unknowingly running away from God, thinking I was doing his will. But when the trouble came, I was convinced that it was the enemy getting in the way of God's plan. But as it turned out, I was the enemy. God had to allow me to have a dream die. God had to allow me to endure the worst slander men can do. God had to allow me to go through human harshness that put a dent in me that I still carry to this day, and honestly will probably continue to do so. That's as far as I'll say. But the point is, I can say with confidence that I have met God as my worst nightmare, and yet I'm still here to tell the tale, man. It's still fresh, and I'm still processing it. But like Jacob, none of us are above deception. And the fact is, you don't reason with a deceiver. You catch him and you break him. How do we know if we're not deceiving ourselves? As I was deceiving myself a few years ago. So let's go back to your current problem. Are you currently feeling alone? Are you still caught in that same battle even after doing all the right things? carrying wounds from the past? Is it not time to dare to throw a Hail Mary and ask, maybe is God trying to get your attention instead of the attention of your adversary, whoever he or she may be? Because it's better to fight God than to hide from him. It's better to be broken and to be living in truth than to be whole and live a lie. What is your worst problem right now? Your greatest anxiety? Are you tired of fighting? Because it might be time to let go and let God change you into something that you never thought you could be.